The year was 2016. Leonardo DiCaprio got an Oscar for getting eaten by a bear. This Is Us was making everybody but me cry, mostly because I never watched it. An all-female Ghostbusters was pissing literally everybody off. Not sure why, though. Holtzman can plug in my electrodes any day. And the American Popular Lexicon acquired a new term.
Or fake news.
Sir,
go ahead.
You're fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
Claiming fake news for the election of Donald Trump. Is there fake news on Facebook? Sure.
And that is what we're talking about today on Fact-Based Living. So a long time before fake news became really a thing in the collective consciousness of Americans, there was an entire community that was pretty much dedicated to fighting what we would now call fake news. And my first exposure to this community would have happened in the mid-2000s or so, when I got my very first iPod. Now, I've never been an early adopter of technology. I don't really see the utility in something that may just be a fad, so I tend to wait for something to become established before I jump onto the bandwagon. And a bunch of people that I knew had iPods, and I finally decided to get myself one and start, messing around with the music and stuff. And, of course, I spent a bunch of time in iTunes looking at songs, and then I eventually stumbled onto this category in the menu of iTunes that was called podcasts. And I'd never really heard this word before. It never really came up before I saw it in the iTunes library. And I started to investigate what was in there. It seemed like an intriguing idea. There was a bunch of like home-produced radio shows that you could listen to, and of course, me being kind of a professional scientist, I kind of gravitated towards the science and technology category. And I just picked a bunch at random. I kind of used the star rating system or whatever it was that iTunes had at the time, and I just kind of went with that. And so some of my first podcasts were I'm also a big fan of history, so I had the History of Rome, which if you haven't listened to, you should totally check out. Mike Duncan makes learning about the history of Rome fun and funny. He has a really good sense of humor. But I also stumbled across shows like The Skeptics Guide to the Universe, which was a weekly show where they brought out science and technology news, and they broke down some of the problems that we were seeing with basically fake news getting out there on the internet. I also followed a lot of things like Monster Talk, which is all about like Yeti and Loch Ness Monster sightings and that kind of stuff. And I also followed one called Skeptoid, which had a lot of individual segments about particular odd claims that were being posited on the internet. And so I discovered, somewhat surprisingly to me, that there was this big community of people that not only were investigating these things, but in many cases debunking them. And my path as a skeptic really sort of enlightened me to the ideas that there are people on the internet that are actively and essentially lying to you. And there was this whole community that kind of fell under the umbrella term of skeptic, that were actively trying to oppose these demonstrably untrue ideas that were out here in internet land. So we've been fighting fake news for decades. I remember as a kid hearing occasionally about conspiracy theories about like John F. Kennedy assassination stuff. And back in those days, the reach of those ideas was pretty much limited to cable TV and occasionally a word of mouth type thing. But as the internet became the open meeting place for ideas, the ability of these demonstrably false ideas was able to spread much faster and much farther, to the point that it would really untrue ideas would spread faster than the truth because there wasn't sufficient time to counter it. It's very easy to throw out 10 or 20 nonsense ideas that we can actually explain away, but our explanation is going to be longer than a soundbite. Meanwhile, the flinging of the pseudoscience maybe only takes a sentence or two. And that's a truly difficult problem because, especially somewhat older Americans like myself, we were kind of conditioned as children that people like journalists were really trying to do their best to make sure that what they were presenting was reasonably accurate. It wasn't always accurate. And of course, as you grow up, you start to learn that, yellow journalism really is a thing. And even with the news media outlet, sometimes you have to research or suspend your judgment until more facts come in. Because oftentimes the media will rush to judgment and get something wrong. But it's even worse with the internet because ideas there can spread like wildfire. We've all heard the term viral video. Viral videos, pop up and almost instantaneously spread to millions of households. And unfortunately, if what's contained in a viral internet, medium is inaccurate, that inaccuracy can propagate throughout the population just like a virus. Now, what are some of the things that the skeptical community has been looking at? Because oftentimes it's characterized as, well, there's just a small subset of people that fight against this particular pseudoscience or that particular conspiracy theory. But in reality, the skeptical community has been fighting against everything that could be considered pseudoscience. And part of that is educating the public, at least the listeners that are actually paying attention to these things, some skills and tips and tricks that you can use to identify the pseudoscience and avoid actually accepting it until you actually have sufficient evidence to do so. So a good example of something that has long been posited, it's actually become a cultural meme at this point, is the Bermuda Triangle. Now, with the Bermuda Triangle, there is this idea that there's this area in the Caribbean, in between the Caribbean and the Atlantic, that roughly forms a triangle that goes from I think it's one of the Keys to Bermuda and down to another island, and that this particular patch of sea is somehow exceptionally treacherous, and that there's, you name it, there's ghosts in there that hijack the ships and airplanes, there's temporal vortexes that carry them to another dimension, whatever crackpot idea you could possibly think would fit into the Bermuda Triangle has been fit into the Bermuda Triangle. But here's the problem with this, is that if you look at the history of the Bermuda Triangle and you get it broken down, it's pretty clear that the entire idea of the Bermuda Triangle was manufactured out of whole cloth by Charles Berlitz. And he did this to sell books, because in the 60s and 70s, when he was writing his stuff, there was a new age movement that was very keen on ideas like ancient aliens and the Bermuda Triangle and, mystic creatures that nobody's ever seen before hiding in the jungles of Africa. So there was a big appetite for fanciful tales that could be real, possibly could be real. And so Charles Berlitz essentially made up the Bermuda Triangle out of a couple of different folklore stories, maybe informed him, but by and large it was just something he created, and it took off like wildfire even in the age before the internet. He wrote books on it, other people wrote books on it, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages were published on the subject, and it was a complete work of fiction. Yet the public gobbled it up. And the more these bad ideas get gobbled up, the more they become part of our collective conscience. And eventually, it became almost a cultural joke that, if something was missing, it must have fallen into the Bermuda Triangle. It actually became a phrase that we used in daily speech. But the Bermuda Triangle doesn't exist by any statistical means you want to throw at it. The Coast Guard and the Navy and the navies and Coast Guards of various nations in the area keep records of ship disappearances and especially shipwrecks. And there's actually maps that show every shipwreck that is known to have happened in the approximate location where it went down across the entire Atlantic, the Caribbean, and the South Atlantic. And these maps are accurate because this is what treasure hunters use to go find some of these wrecks. They know the approximate position where it went down, and they start to search around that area. But if you look at the number of ships that sink or go missing or disappear in the Bermuda Triangle, it's no different statistically from any other patch of water in the surrounding area. There is no extra rate of disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle. There's only this story that was created by an author who wanted to sell books to hippies. That's it. And so many of these stories and claims that you see on the internet break down to almost the same level. Homeopathy is a good example. I've mentioned it in a previous episode that, if you ask the man on the street, homeopathy is like a natural remedy or something, but it's literally the belief that water has memory of it, of anything that was dissolved in it. That's literally what homeopathy means. And yet people still take it as cold medicine and flu prevention, and in some tragic cases, as cancer medication, because people believe that this homeopathic remedy is legit, and it's complete, utter bunk. So today I want to talk to you about why some of this ends up on the internet, and then probably in the next episode I'm going to cover some of the tips and tricks that I've picked up over the years to help you avoid some of these pitfalls on the internet. So, in this next segment, we're going to discuss the various kinds of pseudoscientific lies that you will see on the internet. So, this way, I hope you will be able to avoid them. So in this next segment, we're going to talk about the nature of some of these, I'm going to call them lies, that are on the internet, and how you can avoid falling for them and informing your intuition using these demonstrably untrue ideas. So, why do people make up untrue things on the internet? Well, it's the same reasons that people do a lot of things. But I want to go through each one of them independently because each one of them should be considered when you're evaluating a claim on the internet. Now, the first and obvious reason why people do anything is for money. There are companies that are intentionally overselling what they claim to be some miracle invention. And they do this because they know that most people are not scientifically literate enough to immediately discount their nonsense. And because they're not immediately able to discount their nonsense, they actually have some success in selling whatever their nonsense product is. A good example of this was brought up in the previous episode with Kangen water and their supposed alkaline water curing all sorts of maladies. Well, we know for a fact that that is complete and utter nonsense for the reasons I described in there. Homeopathy has been mentioned. That is a completely useless product. It's so useless that you literally cannot overdose on homeopathy. It has zero effect. They're essentially water pills. But people are buying them and trying to cure legitimate conditions with this demonstrably useless item. Chiropractic is another good example. Chiropractic is 100% pseudoscientific garbage, yet because it's surrounded itself with the trappings of being a medical profession, it has been able to become accepted across most of the community. And the problem is people don't dig deep enough into it to find out what these things are. And oftentimes they don't realize that they're doing damage to themselves by following these practices until it's too late. So number one, be wary of somebody that's trying to sell you a miracle product, because generally the claims are overinflated at best and demonstrably harmful to you at worst. Another example of this is multi-level marketing schemes. This is what has taken over the role that would have been played by a Ponzi scheme had Ponzi schemes not been made illegal. And essentially a multi-level marketing scheme tries to get you to get other people selling the same product beneath you, and that's where you get your money from, is by signing up more people to sell this product. And it is literally a Ponzi scheme. It's a pyramid scheme. And if you actually look at the math of it, I think it's if you go in 7 to 10 levels deep into a Ponzi scheme, you've surpassed the population of the earth. There's literally no way you can make money with a multi-level marketing scheme. So these are all aspects of people being motivated by money to sell you snake oil. So be particularly careful of any claim that is asking you personally to shell out money, because that's where they get you. Now, another form of lie is one that not a lot of people really consider. And honestly, it wasn't one I had heard of until I had been somewhat involved in the skeptical community for quite a while. And that is people that will make stuff up on the internet to be a Poe. Now, the term Poe comes from Poe's Law that basically says that for claims that are utterly ridiculous, there's no way to distinguish a true believer from somebody that's pretending very well to be a true believer. And so there are communities of people that literally pretend that they actually believe the stuff that they're spewing, because for some of them they get kicks out of it because they get to spread these ideas and get the rubes to fall for it, and then they go off to themselves and laugh about the idiots that are falling for their claims. Some people do it just for the fame that they can get online by spreading these ideas. Now, a classic example that I am 100% convinced is an actual Poe is the flat earther Jeranism. If you listen to how he talks, he pauses in just the way you would expect for somebody that is trying to put on an act. And I think he does it because he runs a channel that has, I think, like 100,000 followers or something on it, and he can make some decent money off of YouTube. Not great money, but he can make decent money off of YouTube. And he also gets fame in the flat earth community from having his YouTube channel. So when he gets to go to the flat earth conventions, he's somewhat of a celebrity. So he's personally gaining from his spread of nonsense. So there are a lot of people online that do this. Either they're doing it for kicks or they're doing it for some personal benefit, but they're literally pretending to believe. And some of them are very convincing. They attempt to make good arguments that, if you're not really prepared for them, can sound very convincing. But these people are literally the most dishonest people that you can run into online, because they are intentionally trying to snow you and sell you their pitch. And it's one of the reasons why I really think that we almost need to have legislation where if somebody can be proven to be a Poe, that there has to be some ramification for somebody pretending to be a true believer in a nonsense claim, because believing these nonsense claims is having real effects on real people's lives, and it's frankly despicable. Now, on the other side of the coin from the Poe, before I get off Poes, another classic Poe is Kent Hovind. And I'm convinced that Kent Hovind, who is a young earth creationist, evangelical, basically minister at this point, who fights against evolution and promotes a very unscientific worldview. And he's had the core concepts of evolution explained to him countless times, to the point that it's now a joke. And yet he continues to bring up these old, tired arguments that have been debunked to his face literally hundreds of times. They have been explained to him literally hundreds of times, and he still continues to make the same argument. So at this point, he's either like woefully like non-functioning level of human being stupid, or he knows that he can have a nice cushy day job where he doesn't actually have to work by spreading this nonsense. So on the direct opposite side of the equation from the Poe, you have the true believer. And I believe that for whatever nonsense claim that happens to be out there, a certain percentage of the people that are advocating for it are legitimately true believers. And that's usually what I start with assuming when I first talk to somebody that believes in a particular pseudoscience. I assume that they genuinely believe in this. That's a good null hypothesis to start from. Now, the true believer's problem is not necessarily that they believe, but it's the thought processes that led them to that belief are oftentimes woefully flawed. And in many cases, these people haven't been exposed to any of the ideas that we talk about in the skeptical community, and that's why it's so easy for them to be gullible and fall for these things. The classic example of the true believer, obviously, is the Bible thumping redneck, which doesn't exist in nearly the ratio that some of my skeptical friends would like to believe they exist, but they do exist. And most of them, if you can get past the cognitive dissonance, you can actually have a conversation that will slowly but surely start to change their mind. So the true believers aren't entirely lost. In most cases, it's just that they have misunderstandings about these things. I had a talk last year with a young lady from Australia that was like completely the most unskeptical person that I ever really encountered. And we had a several weeks long internet conversation back and forth where she would bring up points and I would explain them to her why she was wrong about them, and then once she was proven wrong on that one, she would move on to the next one. And it was amazing the amount of stuff that this woman was able to believe in without any decent reason to believe in it. Yet as the conversation developed, you could see that she was starting to make the connections between what science was actually saying and stuff that she could see in her own personal life. So it was very interesting to watch her progression from 100% true believer in damn near every conspiracy theory you've ever seen to not necessarily a skeptic, but at least questioning things for the first time in her life. Like really legitimately questioning things instead of just being a sponge for everything that she saw on the internet. So the true believer kind of goes hand in hand with the person that just has a fundamental misunderstanding of how things work. And honestly, that category is most of us. No matter how skeptical you are, no matter how well researched and well read you are, non-skeptical ideas are going to sneak in slowly but surely. It happens to all of us. And the only counter to this misunderstanding is to improve your skeptical filtering mechanism. There are many things that all of us misunderstand for some time. I find it fairly easy at this point to admit that I am wrong about something. In fact, it's gotten to the point where if there's any doubt in my head about whether or not I might be wrong about something, I will go and do research on it. My employees that I have working underneath me can testify that I say I'm wrong at least 3 or 4 times a day, because I will stumble onto something and say, well, I think I have an idea why this is happening or what that particular standard is, but I don't trust that my intuition is telling me the right thing here, so I'm going to go look it up. And then I find out I'm off. But it's the ability to accept that you're going to be wrong about something, and then to correct that when you're given evidence to the contrary, that really helps you to not fall into the category of the people that misunderstand everything. And one of the ways that people misunderstand things is by listening to the pose and listening to the people who genuinely believe. Because if that's their only source for information, then they may be presented with a false notion of what the subject actually is. And there is no better example of this than what Kent Hovind does with his flock. I'm going to call them, for lack of a better term. What Kent Hovind does with his flock and how he explains evolution to them. He essentially creates a fictitious version of the evolutionary theory that contains little of the actual explanations that evolution provides, and instead props up a alternate fantasy version of evolution to fight against. Because I think deep down he knows that if he allows them to understand what evolution actually is, his argument falls apart. This is also something very common amongst other big pseudoscience communities, including anti-vaxxers and including the flat earthers. There are people that will twist the arguments against their position in such a way that it's easy for them to counter when they're talking to their own people. But of course, when they get themselves into a debate with somebody that's a prepared skeptic and knows how to counter their arguments, it falls apart. But as long as their flock doesn't hear those arguments, then they can perpetuate their nonsense for as long as they possibly can. So while the pose may be a problem, the people that are being lied to by the pose are just as big a problem. Now, the last major category of people that lie and make stuff up on the internet are those people that absolutely refuse to honestly investigate. And this is a tough one for all of us. We all have ideas that we are convinced are correct. And there is a mechanism in our brain that makes us want to hold on to those things that we believe are true to the bitter end. Unfortunately, that mechanism is what allows you to say, I'm not wrong, even in the face of evidence showing you that you're wrong. There's also a mechanism called cognitive dissonance that will allow you to hold two contradictory positions in your head at the same time, and yet somehow be able to get up in the morning. And I'm going to do a whole episode on cognitive dissonance because it really deserves a deep dive. But it's that gut reaction that you have because your intuition is telling you, no, I don't think that's right, because I already know this other thing. And that gut reaction fights against the input of new knowledge, and you really have to fight back against that cognitive dissonance. And it's not easy. So now that we've gone over a few of the people that are actively out there trying to lie to you, let's look at some simple ways to look at evaluating a claim, things that you can apply to everything that you see online. And then I'm going to follow this up with an episode giving you some more tools to understand how to better search for things and how to better research these claims. So now that we've looked at some of the people that are trying to lie to you, let's look at their claims themselves. And I'm going to show you some of the ways that you can filter out some of the more obvious nonsense claims online. I'm going to follow this up with another episode showing you some of the search tools that I use personally when I'm researching these claims, so that you have the tools available to you to better understand. So now let's take a look at some things that you can do to evaluate a specific claim even prior to doing detailed research on it. These are not in-depth forms of investigation, but they're ways of informing your intuition so that you can at least know where to be skeptical and maybe where to be slightly less skeptical. So the first thing you want to look at with any particular claim is the claim very specific or is it very general? A good example of this are supposed cure-alls that you see online. If something is claiming to cure a broad spectrum of different unrelated diseases, then you can be pretty sure that it's nonsense. At least you should be very skeptical of it. Whereas if it's a particular, medical intervention for a very particular disease, then you can start your investigation still being somewhat skeptical, but less so than with the general claim. And something to consider too is that diseases are typically very specific things. So while we might, call all cancers under the umbrella term cancer, each individual one is a very different disease than any of the others, and they're treated very differently because they have different mechanisms and different ways of creating their condition compared to other cancers. So, in general, if the claim is very broad, very ill-defined, and very general, be extra skeptical about it. Now, the second thing to look at is what exactly is the effect that the claim is making. So, with everything, you need to get used to looking at things where you look at the effect that's being posited, and then you look at what mechanism is purported to be causing the effect. So the very first thing you have to look at is the effect something that's measurable, or is it something that's very ill-defined? A good example of this is astrology. The claims that astrologers make are very general, and the effects are not easily testable. They make the claim that when you were born dramatically affects your personality, and then when you actually investigate how they're making their claims for any particular astrological sign, they're very general things that could apply to a large swath of the population, even those that aren't born within that particular astronomical period. So the effect is almost non-existent, just looking at it initially. Like, you can tell it's pretty much not there. As you investigate it further, you'll find it's completely not there. But you need to look at what specifically the claim is saying is the effect that's happening. And another thing to consider is a lot of woo purveyors, especially with diets and medical stuff, they won't really define what the effect is. They'll say, oh, you'll lose weight, but they won't say how much or how rapidly or anything like that. They'll just say, oh, you lose weight. And it's too general for you to actually make a decision on. Now, I already mentioned this, but after looking at the effect, there has to be a proposed mechanism that's defined for what's causing the effect. So, if you don't have a mechanism, then there's not much you can go with. For example, the alkaline diet and alkaline water proponents tend to not explain fully what mechanism is causing the cancer curing or whatever general health effect. They just sort of define it in very vague terms, and they don't specifically call out what the mechanism is. Now, everything in science will call out the mechanism that is behind the particular effect that's being observed. Unless it's some very, very, very new discovery where we figured out that there's an effect, but we haven't pinned down the exact mechanism behind it yet, in which case you should really suspend judgment until the mechanism has actually been posited. Now, when looking at a mechanism, you need to apply the same rules as looking at an effect. You need to ask yourself, how clearly defined is the mechanism? Now, again, pretty much everything in science will have a very clearly defined mechanism if we understand what's going on. It will explain how the effect is being created, not just that the effect is being created. The next thing you need to look at is, how did they determine the mechanism? Was it by a single one-off study with a very small sample size, or was it because of multiple investigations, all of which had data that converged on what the explained mechanism is? Because that's how things are done in science. Is we don't just do a simple preliminary study and then stop there and say, well, it must be this, because we know that even if you can correlate two things together, that doesn't necessarily imply that one is causing the other. So you have to do very precise, very well constructed investigations into what the mechanism is that's underlying the effect. And this is something that the mass media gets wrong all the time, because they're looking for clickbait. They're looking for stuff to put into their news stories that is interesting and is going to keep people watching. And so a lot of times when they report on scientific studies, what they're doing is they're searching around for a study that has a very sexy sounding title to it, like coffee prevents cancer. And really what they're doing is they're looking at a very preliminary study that was only looking to see if there was potentially an effect there, and they're only looking at correlation. The mechanism hasn't been posited yet. Nobody's done a large sample size to even confirm that the correlation actually exists, yet the media is reporting this as if it is a done deal that coffee cures cancer. And that is a huge problem. Part of the reason why people think that science is always changing its mind is because the dumbass media is constantly reporting these very preliminary studies, and some of them find an effect and some of them don't. And so then when they report both studies, one study says, coffee shows a increased risk of cancer, and then the next study says coffee actually shows a decreased risk of cancer. And that's because they were both very preliminary studies that, quite honestly, somebody was probably publishing just to publish and, keep up, because that's something that unfortunately you have to do in science, is constantly being, you're constantly pushed to publish something. And if you're not publishing, then you're perishing. That's what the expression, how the expression goes. So a lot of these studies are very small sample size, very preliminary investigations. Many of them may not even be really properly designed to even isolate an effect. And so you really can't tell anything from these type studies. So why the media is, even publishing them is a big bone of contention that a lot of people in science have, because if there's not enough data to actually come to a conclusion, then there's no reason to communicate that to the public. But yet the media will go out, they will, buy their way through the paywalls that normally act as kind of the gatekeepers to keep people that don't have expertise in the field from really doing the peer review process, because believe me, there's a lot of kooks out there. And so they'll pay past the paywalls, they'll find some preliminary poorly constructed study, and then they'll report that as fact. So what you need to do is actually look at how the study was performed, how big the sample size is, and if there's even enough data there for you to tell if there is a mechanism that can even be posited. And that's the big thing you really have to look at, is how much data was it? Now, remember that the Andrew Wakefield garbage study that he published that basically triggered the entire modern anti-vaxxer movement was only 12 subjects that were hand-picked to get the conclusion he wanted, and then he published it in the Lancet. And unfortunately, the Lancet allowed the publication to go through, even though the sample size was quite obviously way too small to even see if there was an effect there, much less a mechanism. And he was positing that the mechanism was the MMR vaccine. Well, you can't tell that from 12 data points. And I'm going to do a whole episode on how to investigate scientific studies and how to actually read a scientific study. But the basic rule of thumb is, if you're trying to really look for an effect, you need a sample size that is large enough to balance out any statistical aberration that could be occurring in your study. And so the general rule of thumb is you need at least 1,000, preferably 10,000 data points for an effect study to see if there's even a correlation between these two things. And then you need to actually, posit a mechanism. You need a study that is somewhere in the vicinity of 50,000 to 100,000 data points in order to get a realistic sample size. Because especially with things in the medical field, which is what I used to work in, there are a lot of extraneous factors that you simply can't control for. For example, if you're testing a new medication, people don't always remember to include all of their medications on the forms that you give them. And so there may be drug interactions that aren't controlled in the study. There are significant biological differences from person to person in how they metabolize things, and all sorts of factors along those lines. And all those factors can contribute to problems with your study. So the way that, the best way, especially with a biological study, to eliminate a lot of those factors is to have a very large sample size so that all of those variables sort of even out over the course of a 100,000 person study. So if you look at the actual study and you look in the abstract, and then under the methods section they say their sample size was 100, well, there's no conclusion you can really draw from that. And that is an important thing to take away from this episode, is that sample sizes really do matter. Now, while we're on the subject of sample sizes, the next thing you should really be looking for is, has this particular claim been independently verified? This is where peer review comes in. And people seem to have a misunderstanding about what peer review is. It doesn't mean that just any Joe Schmo has looked at your data and come to their own conclusion, because none of us has an expertise outside of our specialty that we can actually make a qualified judgment, because our intuition isn't informed enough by the particular subject matter. And so it's awfully difficult for us to come to a conclusion about it. And also, expertise really matters when you're looking at very detailed claims and very detailed data sets. So when you look at a particular study or a particular claim, you have to look and see, has some other organization that doesn't have an axe to grind, does not have a profit motive, have they actually investigated it? In fact, this is the way that drugs and medical devices are actually validated. You see a lot of claims about, the big pharma and all that, but there are actually independent testing labs that evaluate medical devices and evaluate pharmaceuticals, and they don't have a profit motive to go ahead and pass the product. They're certified by government agencies such as the FDA as being completely independent, and the way this works is that, for example, I used to work in cardiovascular devices, and so say somebody's got a new heart valve or a new stent that they want tested. So they will do all their own research to make sure that they think their device is going to pass, because it's very expensive to bring a new medical device to market. Just paying for the samples to actually send to the lab to actually have testing done can cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's literally just to get the parts to send to the lab so you can get the testing done. So they will do their own testing, and they'll make sure that, yeah, this looks like it has a reasonable chance of passing the standard. And for every drug and every medical device out there, there's a standard that says this is how you have to test the device, because we know these are the potential consequences of a device failing. And the standard is written by the independent lab, testing organizations and the government regulatory body, and it follows the general standard science principles. Like, we know that there's a possibility that heart valves will damage the red blood cells as the blood passes through them. And so we know that we need to do a type of study that's going to ensure that the device isn't chewing up your red blood cells. If you're doing a stent, you need to make sure that it's not, it's physically strong enough to be able to withstand being inside of a person for 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, depending on, the longevity of the device. And so the way we do that is we actually strain the device and we run it at an accelerated time rate, but giving it the exact same forces it would feel in your body. And we will run that for enough cycles to simulate being in a person for a decade or two. And that gives us an idea if any of the wires are going to break, if any of the parts are going to fall off, float through your body, and cause an embolism. So we look at all of these factors, and the company that's trying to produce the device will then produce the samples that are exactly like how they're going to manufacture them afterwards, and they will send it to an independent lab, and they will pay that lab to do the testing on it. Now, the lab gets paid whether the device passes or fails, so they don't have any profit motive on it. All we want to do is ensure that the device is actually safe. And so we set up our studies, we write a protocol, we ensure that the government regulatory organization signs off on the protocol that we're going to be using, and then we run the test. And we test the device to as close a conditions as we possibly can to what's in the human body. It's a very difficult process. We take a lot of data, we do enough samples to make sure that we have a statistically relevant conclusion that we can draw from it, and we test the heck out of these things. We do everything we can to break the device in the lab before it breaks inside of a person. That doesn't mean we always get it 100% right, but we do the very best we can to actually ensure that that device works. And if it doesn't, the conclusion of the study will say, this device failed. It's supposed to run 400,000 cycles inside of a human. It failed at 100,000 cycles. It needs to be redesigned. And we send that data to the FDA, and we send that data back to the company that made the device, and then they go back to the drawing board. So, contrary to popular belief on some sites, there is no big pharma, conspiracy about things, because there are independent testing bodies that ensure that what's being released is as safe as we possibly can make it, knowing the facts that we know going in. So make sure that the effect that's being posited and the mechanism for that effect have actually been independently verified by somebody else. This is a massive problem for pseudoscience sellers. People like the Kangen Waters and stuff like that. They don't get independent lab verifications. It's also a massive problem for the supplement industry, which has no independent verification of any of their claims because they've lobbied not to be included under the umbrella of pharmaceuticals. So literally nobody is looking at your vitamins to make sure that they actually even contain what they say they do, which is a huge problem I'm going to be covering later. But yeah, the supplement industry is fraught. In fact, a recent study found that like 60% of the supplements didn't even contain the active ingredient that they said they did. So the last thing that you want to consider initially when evaluating a claim is how much of an impact is this going to have on your life? Is it a fairly simple thing that you can, integrate into your routine that doesn't cost any money? Or is it going to be a massively expensive exercise or diet plan? Is it going to be incredibly invasive on your time? Is it going to cause you to do a bunch of things that you normally wouldn't do? Because generally, if it's going to disrupt your life to the point that you're having to do, way too many extra things for it, then it's probably A, pseudoscience, and B, not worth the time and money you're going to spend on it, especially if it didn't meet any of the criteria above. So that is a major thing to look at, is how much is it going to actually ask of you to do in your life. So that's my short-ish take on fake news. I'm going to follow this up with a second episode on how to do some research and tools that I use when I go online to actually find the correct information, so I'm not just taking this at face value and then making changes to my life. So the next episode is going to be entirely about how to use the internet so that you don't fall for these things. So this has been an episode of Fact-Based Living. If you liked it, please give me a like and then subscribe below. I do also have a Twitter at Fact-Based Living, and join my Discord. I will include a link in the show notes. Alright, talk to you soon. Bye.